Good morning and good afternoon to everybody out there. This is Michael Britton. I am the Executive Director for the National Association for Latino Healthcare Executives. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce to you two ladies that have been very involved in combating human trafficking, an area that I think that everybody would admit that we're a little naive to. And we hope this presentation today will give you a little more insight as to how to combat human trafficking. Before I begin, you can type in your questions on the right-hand side of your screen. I will read the question at the end of the presentation. Then I will be able to turn it back over to whoever you directed the question towards, okay? So without any further ado, what I'd first like to do is introduce Dr. Hani Stoklosa. Dr. Stoklosa is the Executive Director of HEAL Trafficking and also emergency physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital with appointments at Harvard Medical School, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Dr. Stoklosa has also published the very first textbook addressing the public health response to trafficking called Human Trafficking is a Public Health Issue, a Paradigm Expansion in the United States. I would also like to introduce to you Lara Castellanos, who is the Associate Director at the American Hospital Association, as many of us know as AHA, for Health Research and Educational Trust. In her role, Laura manages the association-wide initiative, Hospitals Against Violence, focusing on educating the healthcare field on leading practices and innovative approaches to workplace safety and community violence prevention, including human trafficking. Without much further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Hani Stoklosa, who will begin our presentation. Dr. Stoklosa?
Michael, Laura
or Laura,
thanks,
I'm sorry.
honey. Yeah, no worries. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'll start this presentation today, but most definitely want to make sure that I give the time to Dr. Stoklosa, who will dive definitely a lot deeper into the work as healthcare professionals and leaders and our role in combating human trafficking. So thank you all for having us today. Again, Michael, thank you for the introduction. I'm the Associate Director at the American Hospital Association, leading the work around hospitals against violence. My role today is to just give you a little bit of background about the work that AHA is doing around violence prevention, specifically around human trafficking, and then hand it over to Dr. Stoklosa. So back in the fall of 2016, the American Hospital Association's Board of Trustees recognized violence as a growing public health issue, and the need to actually create an initiative that could support our membership. Our focus was in providing educational offerings, tools, resources, and supporting data and information collection so we could advance the work that hospitals are doing around violence prevention. We recognize that hospitals have definitely a role in community violence prevention, but also recognize the ongoing concerns around workplace violence. And this graphic just shows different perspectives and the different issues that we were aware of. And through the input of our membership, we soon focused on a few issues that we felt as an association that we could be of most support. Of course, we still do anything and everything to support our membership, but wanted to create a more focused approach. You'll see here our framework is really, again, keeping the two focus, again, community violence and workplace violence. And one of the reasons why we decided to focus on human trafficking was because of the need to really create a lot of awareness around the issue. We recognize that hospitals were in a crucial role in a victim of trafficking's life, that they have come into most of the times have come to interact with the healthcare system, and we saw the need to help create the awareness, the education and training to start combating this issue. Again, this is part of a few of the initiatives that we have, but definitely one that has increased a lot of our attention as we continue to get some feedback. As you'll see here, again, we have created a campaign around combating human trafficking. And one of the things I'm happy to share with everyone today, and Dr. Stoklosa has been key in getting this work, advancing this work, is we've recently learned from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, that a proposal that was sponsored by the American Hospital Association in partnership with Catholic Health Initiatives and Mass General Hospital was approved to publish ICD-10 codes for human trafficking, both for adults and pediatrics. And those will be launching October of this year. And for us, and I know a lot of the people that have been putting a lot of work into this issue, is quite a victory. It's our opportunity to really start collecting some data, to really start educating our providers to be able to provide trauma-informed care, survivor-informed care, and seeing how we can continue to support our hospitals and providers as they're coming and interacting with victims of human trafficking. So with that background, I want to just again introduce and thank Hani, Dr. Stoklosa, for being part of this webinar. She has been supporting the work at the American Hospital Association really from the very beginning. She also is part of the steering committee that helps advise the work of the AHA around human trafficking, and is definitely very well networked in the field and with the experts. So with that, I believe I'll kick it over to Hani. Hani?
Perfect. Thank you. And you can just move on to the next slide. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity to just really put human trafficking on your radars. My goal today is to give you a sense of what trafficking is, what it means in the United States, what it means for Latino communities in the United States, as well as some actionable steps for all of you to take in your healthcare systems coming out of this webinar. So as an emergency medicine doctor and as a healthcare provider myself, I always like to start off with a case. So we're going to start off with the case of Pedro. Next slide. So he comes into, let's say, an emergency department, and this is kind of generally what he looks like, and I'm going to get into more of the specifics. Next slide. So he's a young male, probably late 20s, and his name is Pedro. He comes to through the emergency triage area. There, he's noted to be accompanied by his friend Martin, who says that, oh, he got injured on the construction site. We just need to get him checked out, just get him some pain medication. I really just need to get him back to work. Martin insists on staying with him because he doesn't speak English very well, and so he's offering to provide interpretation. Next. Pedro doesn't have any identification, and Martin apologizes and says, oh, we forgot to bring it, but it doesn't really matter. We don't have insurance. We'll just pay cash for his care. Next slide. So on clinical assessment, so the triage nurse is checking him in, and she notices that he's pale, that he looks ill for a construction worker, and as she's going to take his blood pressure, she notices that he has bruising on his arms, kind of in different stages of healing. He doesn't speak spontaneously or make eye contact directly with the triage nurse, and anytime questions are posed to Pedro, they're answered by Martin. So if he does answer questions, he's answering just sort of in some monosyllables. So there are a lot of concerning features in there, right? I made this case such that kind of every single interaction, every single piece is concerning. Laura, I'm going to ask you to go back to the first slide that has words on it related to the case, and I'm just going to review some of these concerning features. So it's no surprise, right? I told you this is a webinar on human trafficking. You know that this is a case of trafficking, but I actually stop it at this place because I want some of these red flags or some of these warning signs that may make you think about abuse in some other way, for you to add human trafficking to that differential diagnosis, or add human trafficking to the list of potential forms of violence or abuse that patients in your healthcare setting may be experiencing. So just to go through some of those warning signs that we see here, we really see that Martin is controlling most of the communication all throughout. The construction sector work that Pedro is engaged in is in some ways a warning sign, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. There's also this focus on him getting pain medication and getting back to work, as opposed to, usually if someone is a friend and they're coming in with someone else to the emergency department, they're there because they care about their health, right? And it's not so much about getting back to work. So that's also something that's a warning sign. And then, it's possible that the reason it looks like the communication is being controlled is that Pedro doesn't speak English as a first language, and that Martin really feels like he's helping out. Next slide. But there are a few other things that come out of the communication that are concerning. The fact that he has no identification, we see that traffickers use the threat of deportation as a means of controlling their victims. So that's a red flag. Next. And then that fearful demeanor, where really the way that the eye contact is happening, or rather in this case not really happening, makes it concerning that this isn't just about the language, that there's some power dynamic here. And then on the medical side of things, he looks like he's malnourished and that he has these old and new bruises. Again, these may be related to the just normal work that he's doing, or there might be something else that's going on. Next slide. So again, I started off with a case that doesn't end with a certainty of trafficking, but rather a possibility of trafficking, somebody that you would want to explore that further with. And you may actually be concerned about some of these other forms of abuse. The more that I do work on human trafficking, the more that I see that what we're learning about trafficking is so intersectional with what we've learned from other forms of violence and abuse. The great news in that is that we can build on the evidence basis that we have, the protocols, what we know in terms of good response to these other forms of abuse. We also know that this intersectionality plays out for our patients' lives, that sometimes a prior history of child abuse, for example, might make someone vulnerable to later on in their life being trafficked. And the other way that I see these intersectionalities are that these other things that are not the human trafficking here are often the labels that the patients that I've identified as victims of trafficking have used for themselves. So I've never had a patient say, "Hi, I'm a victim of human trafficking, help me." But I've had patients that have had said, "My partner's hurting me, help me." And once we built trust, we found out and looked beneath the surface, we found out that they were actually being trafficked. And we actually had a patient, one example was she had come in and out of our emergency department and been admitted to our ICU multiple times for DKA, so diabetic ketoacidosis, diabetic crisis. And no one had asked her, what was going on. And it then turned out that the reason she wasn't taking her insulin is that she was depressed. And she was depressed because of the abuse she was experiencing in her home. And her partner was not only hurting her physically, but also was trafficking her for sex. So that's just one example of how these can play out. So what is trafficking? Next slide. So trafficking is defined by U.S. law, and you can just click all these through. The U.S. law that lays out what the definition of trafficking is called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And it's a little bit of mental acrobatics here because this is really defined in terms of the trafficker. So we're so used to, as health professionals, thinking about the client, thinking about the patient. But the way the definition is laid out is in terms of the actions of the trafficker. So just to talk through this action, means, purpose, model. The trafficker can be engaged in any of these activities. They could be involved in the recruitment at the country of origin, harboring, transportation, providing different materials, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting. So really anything along the chain. And there has to be some means, and there should be a big or between these three things. So, a trafficker may use physical or sexual violence or force, but they might just use fraud. They might just use coercion. They may use a bait and switch tactic. So really only one of those things needs to be is sufficient in terms of the definition. And then for two purposes is the way that our trafficking laws has laid out. So that somebody may be trafficked for sex, or they may be trafficked for labor. And then click the next arrow. So really importantly, under the age of 18, if you can just go back, sir, under the age of 18, anyone engaged in commercial sex does not need to have these actions of the trafficker exerted against them. So there does not need to be force, fraud, or coercion. So anyone that is exchanging sex for something of value, that qualifies as trafficking by U.S. law. So really important caveat. Next. We see these main types of human trafficking. So a lot of people imagine that trafficking just happens transnationally, and that'll be a large focus of this call, this webinar. But trafficking can happen even within one's own home. So we see situations in the United States where maybe a mother is fleeing a domestic violence situation, and the only place that they're able to find where they can get a roof over their heads, the landlord says, if you want to stay here, then I want to sleep with your daughter. So we see these horrific intersections of different forms of violence, but that would be an example of familial sex trafficking and then within one's own home. So there does not have to be a crossing of state lines or national lines in order for something to qualify as human trafficking according to U.S. law. And then the major categories that we talked about, labor and sex trafficking. Next. So data in general on trafficking is really hard to come by, which makes sense, right? It's a clandestine activity hidden behind closed doors in many cases. And so it's really difficult to truly get a sense of the scope. This is some helpful demographic data from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center from 2014. So we see here on the sex trafficking side of things, 27% were foreign nationals, 41% U.S. citizens. And on the labor trafficking side of things, a much larger proportion of foreign nationals. Next. So what makes someone vulnerable to trafficking? And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but when we think in those categories of transnational trafficking and domestic trafficking, on the transnational trafficking side of things, those that are in movement, in transit, are more likely to be exploited by traffickers, refugees, asylum seekers. As I mentioned, traffickers use documentation status, including those that are undocumented, but also sometimes work within visa schemes in order to recruit their victims. And then also through forced marriages, we see that as well. Next slide. So in preparation for this webinar, I looked for the data. So, with the caveat that there's not great data on a lot of things in trafficking. And the richest source of information on the intersections of Latino populations and human trafficking I found was through the Polaris hotline. So Polaris is an anti-trafficking organization that runs the National Human Trafficking Resource Center and hotline. They take hotline calls 24/7 in over 300 languages. And so they have a lot of data on the scope of trafficking within the United States from their calls. So I wanted to highlight some things that are from a few of their recent reports, specifically related to Latino populations. So we see that there's forced drug muling. So Latino cartels will sometimes either promise their victims protection in their migration to the United States, or in some cases actually abduct people and then force them to carry drugs across the border. So traffickers will, we do see that they force some people to commit crimes as one more way of coercing their victims. We see trafficking of Latino populations in the agricultural industry in the United States. And in this case, as I alluded to earlier, sometimes these are undocumented workers, and then sometimes the traffickers actually link themselves to the victim through an H-2A visa. And what they often do is charge a very large sum, whether in recruitment or travel fees, that then becomes a debt that victim is going to have to pay back. And then once they come to the United States, the system is so rigged against them that there's no way they can pay that debt. And that debt, or sometimes that visa, is the tether. Then on the sex trafficking side of things, so as of 2017, October of 2017, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center had identified 4,300 sex trafficking victims with ties to Mexico or Central America. Of these, more than 88% were women and 45% were minors under the age of 18. And a common typology that the trafficking hotline has seen in terms of this particular population are that they're trafficked for sex into cantinas or bars. So essentially that cantinas or bars in the United States end up being sort of brothels. And what they saw in terms of a common pattern was that victims were deceived and enticed with false promises of love, good jobs, or safe passage to the United States, and then were forced to engage in commercial sex. Often without legal status, money, or English fluency, they become trapped, controlled by their traffickers through brutal threats and other forms of abuse. And traffickers who exploit these women and girls use a variety of business models and network structures. So in addition to these examples, I want you to think in your own mind about what are some other underregulated and underpaid industries that traffickers might use in the United States. So the reason I frame it as this is that, again, kind of in the weird way of imagining things from the trafficker's perspective, they're looking to not get caught, and they're also looking to maximize their own profits. And so the industries in the United States that are underregulated and underpaid are the ones where we see trafficking most commonly. Next slide. So nannying, domestic work, elder care, agriculture industry, construction work. Next slide. Dry cleaning, nail salons. So traffickers are looking for that vulnerability. Next slide. When we think about populations that are on the move, we know that today in world history, people are migrating in epic proportions. Some of them are migrating to seek a better life, but there are also a number of migrants who are migrating away from situations of humanitarian crises, of natural disasters, escaping violence in their community. And if you just imagine that you're one of these individuals here where you've been uprooted from your community safety and structures, you don't have a job, you have no roof over your head. If somebody comes along and offers you a job, how do you know if that individual is out to scheme you, out to fool you, or whether they actually have a job? Are they a trafficker or are they actually an employer? Next. We also see that addiction can be a vulnerability. So in the Boston area, traffickers recruit directly from substance use treatment facilities, methadone clinics, because they know that an addiction is the perfect tether to their victim. Next. There are also links to our child welfare system, where somebody who has experienced abuse in their past may be easily swayed by someone who comes along and poses as a boyfriend or a loved one. Next slide. So as you can see, even though, traditionally what we see in media in terms of trafficking and even what we see on SVU, for example, oftentimes those situations are the extreme examples. Yes, traffickers sometimes do use chains. Yes, sometimes they do lock their victims up, but they often are using invisible chains. Next slide. The threat of deportation, as I talked about. So this is from a study that I did with colleagues at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, International Organization for Migration, and we did qualitative research talking to survivors of various forms of exploitation around the world. And this is an example from a victim, because in the agency they told me, if you call the police, you'll be deported all at once. They said you're here illegally, but now I know I was here illegally. I had rights, but I was not aware of them. So even in the case where somebody had rights, the trafficker knew that that threat of deportation was so compelling that they used it. Next slide. Traffickers keep their victims in check by controlling their basic needs. So controlling their access to shelter or lack thereof, controlling sleep, making their victims walk for a long time, sometimes hours overnight, in order to keep them delirious and keep them subjugated. Next. Sometimes traffickers control food as well. So this is a case from the Boston area where a trafficker would buy maybe 3 or 4 value meals and throw them in the middle of the floor for 20 women to have to fight over each other in order just to get a morsel of food. Next slide. Traffickers control food in other ways. So this is a quote from a survivor who had to eat the dog food in her home in order to survive. When I cooked for them, I taste, that's all. I sliced the food for the dog. I also ate some. That's what I did. I never sit, so I did not tell them I ate some of the food for the dog. So caring for the family day in and day out, cooking the family meals, but not being able to eat it herself. Next. We often see in sex trafficking, labor trafficking schemes, domestic transnational trafficking schemes, this elusive price of freedom that traffickers will set for their victims. Sometimes that's the debt somebody paid in order to come into the United States. And as I mentioned earlier, the system's rigged against them. So, for example, they may be paying $2,000 a month rent to live in a trailer where there's no toilets, no access to running water, leaking holes in the roof. They may be paying $20 for a bar of soap. So everything is controlled such that they're not able to ever reach that amount of money. These are actually photos from case files from a case out of Florida where the victim had to subtract shower water from their list. Next. So given this level of control, it's really not been until recently that we know that trafficking victims access healthcare in the United States while they're being trafficked. So this is a study from my colleague McKinney Chisholm-Straker where they asked victims of labor and sex trafficking, did you access healthcare while you were being trafficked? And 68% of those victims did while they were being trafficked. To me, that represents a huge opportunity and responsibility for healthcare. So how do we identify a trafficking victim? It comes down to pattern recognition, like many pieces of medicine. Some things in medicine we do algorithmically or are easily identifiable. Like, so as an emergency medicine doctor, if somebody's having a full-blown heart attack or a STEMI, I get an EKG and I have my answer. This is not like that. This is much more in the category of how we've been trained to identify other forms of abuse, where we think about the health pieces and the context pieces. On the health side of things, they may present in a delayed fashion. And the context piece, just as we saw with Pedro, he may be accompanied by somebody. They may not know how they got where they are because they're being transported so frequently, or they just might not know the language and not know exactly how they got to their place. I was recently doing a training in a community where somebody was trafficked in the restaurant industry and had literally walked from the accommodations, in quotes, but the housing that the trafficker had them staying in to the restaurant every day for 2 years. And they had no idea what city they were in because everything was controlled, their information flow and everything. Next. So an example of delayed care for something simple. So a simple toe infection in this domestic worker resulted in the person almost needing to have their toe amputated by the time they accessed healthcare. Next slide. Now, when we think about the health consequences of trafficking, the way that I think about it is to think about what is that person exposed to while they're being trafficked? Not just the work that they're doing, but also the living conditions and their environment. Next slide. This is a table from the International Organization for Migration that lays out all the different kind of exposures, all the things that happen to them while they're being trafficked, and then potential health problems. So you can see this is a laundry list. There's no one chief complaint that a trafficking victim may present with. Next slide. An example of how an exposure during a health or during their trafficking experience can manifest itself in terms of health problems is exposures in the textile industry. So this is from the study that I did with colleagues from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And these victims were working in a textile factory. So they were making clothing, and they didn't have personal protective equipment. So they didn't have face masks in order to protect themselves from all of the dust that was flying around the factory. And so they kind of made these ones on their own. But as we know about personal protective equipment, that they're really, with these homemade ones that they were using, they were still inhaling a lot of those really dangerous dust fragments. Next slide. And then the result that we saw was that in some cases this caused silicosis, in some cases tuberculosis, because they didn't have access to the personal protective equipment. Next slide. We also see environmental exposures that can lead to health problems. So in this case, there was this dog that was running around in the environment where they were living and working, and the dog had scabies. And so as she says here, I was cooking and I could no longer endure the itchiness. Next. So as I mentioned, there really could be any health consequence of trafficking that somebody might bring access healthcare for, and also on exam, there really could be clues from head to toe. They might see tattoo patterns. We might see signs of bruising in different stages, like Pedro. Next slide. Yep. And they might actually come to a healthcare setting because of the mental health consequences of trafficking. So the mental health consequences of trafficking are pernicious and pervasive and really profound in a way that is really devastating for those that have survived these traumatic experiences. Really, what we see similar to returning war prisoners of war and those that have been in the military, if not worse. This is a quote from a survivor. I felt like nothing can make it better. I felt like I was only a piece of meat with two eyes. I thought I would end up like nothing. There was no hope for me. Next slide. To really drive this home, I thought this was really powerful. This is from a UK study by my colleagues at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where 71% of the victims were even afraid of their traffickers after they were out of the trafficking situation. So that haunting that stays with you and the constant fear that they're going to find you. Next. These next couple of slides just kind of show, and Laura, you can just kind of quickly go through them, but the extensive depression symptoms, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, as well as PTSD symptoms that survivors of labor and sex trafficking experience. Recurrent thoughts, nightmares, feeling on guard all the time. So I have this slide here for a few reasons. The reason I chose cats is I love cats to illustrate this point. But when approaching potential victims of trafficking, one of the things that prevents health professionals from seeing victims in front of them is lack of awareness. There are a number of different structural things that we could talk about, but one of them is implicit bias or unconscious bias. So who we imagine might be a victim is going to affect whether we screen somebody for a form of violence. So, when we think about domestic violence, you rarely would imagine that a male might be a victim of domestic violence, but we know that LGBT and gender and sexual minorities are more likely to experience infant partner violence. But the complex way that our implicit biases are formed and the different layers to it really affect our care for trafficking victims. And in particular, the effects of trauma on victims of violence can manifest itself in dissociation. So like the cat on the left, where there's this blankness, the separation of emotions from the physical environment, and sometimes can manifest itself as aggression. So this is actually a way that survivors or victims are surviving each and every day. And the natural response to trauma may be for an individual to be more agitated. And so if you look at the cat on the right, you're less likely to just naturally, innately imagine that person might be a victim. So a lot of what I do in training health professionals around trafficking is also helping them to think about these unconscious barriers to victim identification. So how do we approach a potential victim of trafficking? Next. So what is the goal? Next. So is it this? Is it rescue? So no, the goal is not rescue, but we're talking about modern day slavery here. And so it is very natural. And we see this over and over again, where the natural inclination is to try to instantly extricate somebody from that situation. But if you pause and think about it and realize that a trafficker is controlling a victim's every single move, we also don't know what kinds of threats are exerted against that victim. They may be told that their trafficker is holding their child, and if they tell anybody, that their child will be harmed. So you can only see what you can see in the room, and you have no idea what's going on in a victim's mind. But we've learned this from intimate partner violence, that if you try to just save somebody and go against their will and doing that in the moment, that you're actually going to do more harm than good. So the goal is different than what we would imagine. It's not rescuing, it's opening the door. So what I mean by that is that you want them to know that your health facility is a place that they can return to if and when they're ready to get out of that situation. So it's through education and building trust. It's important to prioritize safety. I've seen an entire spectrum of safety situations, from a victim coming in completely by themselves, not with anybody, to a trafficker following the ambulance in. It's important to find a way to talk to the person alone, and to use a professional interpreter. So how do you ask about trafficking? So as I mentioned earlier, it's educating and providing resources. Next. And as all of us would guess, it's not about interrogating. The reason I have this slide is and show this picture is, I can't tell you how many times I've had trainees, had residents that are like, I know something's wrong, and they really do almost get into this like interrogation mode where they've asked every single person to ask this person, and they've tried all their tricks, and it actually shuts the person down. So trusting the innate wisdom of survivors that if and when they're ready to disclose the information, that they that this is, again, that your health facility has an open door. I provide these potential screening questions here. These are based on a study that's validating some simple language screening questions for runaway and homeless youth. I like them because they encompass a lot of different scenarios, and I think it's helpful to have language to start talking about these other parts of our patients' lives with them. Framing it as, I care about not just your health in the traditional way, but I see your health is linked to your work as well as your relationships. And so depending on the scenario, you may ask them one of these questions as a way of opening that door. So have you ever worked or done other things in a place that made you feel scared or unsafe? Have you ever been tricked or forced into doing any kind of work that you did not want to do? Have you ever been afraid to leave or quit a work situation due to fears of violence or threats of harm to yourself or your family? Has someone you work for ever controlled the money you earned or kept money you earned in exchange for transportation, food, or rent without your consent? Have you ever received anything in exchange for sex, a place to stay, gifts, or food? So if you have that individual in front of you that you're pretty sure, you have a high suspicion this individual is being trafficked, what are those next steps? So of course, follow your state mandated reporting laws. So under the age of 18, that is going to involve engaging child protective services. And for an adult, it's building trust, not doing harm, not trying to rescue, and offering whatever help they need. So as they see it. So again, giving that agency back, giving that control back. And if and when they're ready, refer to resources. So those resources are going to depend on the community that you work in, the communities that your health care facilities are in. And I'm happy to also provide links to, the federal government has some really good maps of state links to resources, state profiles that can help you have a starting place as you're thinking about in your health organization, what are those referrals going to be? My hope is that as a result of this talk that, if you can just go back one more, that each and every one of you will consider developing a protocol in your health system. So it's imperative to have a plan in place, just like we have plans in place for domestic violence, for child abuse, The way we did in our own hospital is we broadened out the protocol because there were a lot of common denominators, and now we have an interpersonal violence protocol of which trafficking is a subset. We have on the HEAL website not only a protocol toolkit, which is a manual essentially from A to Z, thinking through external stakeholder mapping all the way through monitoring and evaluation about what that plan might look like. And we've provided example protocols, including Dignity Health's shared learning manual, which is a really detailed way of approaching trafficking within a health system. And we also have access to training and technical assistance that we're happy to help you with. And I just want to underscore what Laura said at the beginning. AHA has been the leader on ICD codes for human trafficking, and this website is really a resource. So on the website here, in terms of what is this going to mean for the health community as these codes go live October 1st, they have an excellent fact sheet and video for you to access there. And I welcome you to join our community. HEAL Trafficking is a network of over 3,000 professionals that are fighting trafficking from a public health perspective. Our website has a lot of resources, and it's free to join our listserv. Just go to our website, healtrafficking.org. So just to close with this note, I know this is a lot to take in, but I see this as exciting for healthcare. We really do have an opportunity and a responsibility to respond to trafficking. And what is your response going to be?
Thank you, Hani. I really can't thank you enough. And again, this is Laura Castellanos. Just want to kind of close it, the session, and hopefully get some of your questions and some interaction as well. And I just got to say, this is not the first time I've heard Dr. Stocklosa, and every single time I do, I learn more. And my hope in putting this webinar together was really to empower us Latinos and healthcare leaders to understand our communities, to really be advocates for our communities. I think that's a shared mission and value as leaders in healthcare that can bring us together and hopefully help us further combat this global crisis of human trafficking. So thank you again, Dr. Stocklosa, and for everybody joining. And Michael, I hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Laura. At this time, what I'd like everybody to have an opportunity to do is ask questions of Dr. Stocklosa and Laura. You both were so kind as to do this webinar for us. This has been probably the most informative webinar I have ever attended. I've had people texting me around the country saying, boy, I didn't realize this also included labor. And very, very good presentation. Thank you both enough for this. If anybody, I will wait a few more seconds to see if I get any questions whatsoever. Please feel free to type it in and hit the send button to me, and I will read the question accordingly. So I will wait a few more seconds here, and if nobody has any questions, we will also distribute this to everyone via our distribution list. My trusty right arm, Kim Rodriguez, will send the link out, and this will also be on the website for NALI. So you can click on there also under webinars. Okay, well, apparently we don't have any questions, a lot of quiet people today. But again, thank you everybody for attending, and we will certainly end our webinar at this time. Thank you all so much for attending. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.